Welcome to today's presentation on rights of the surface owner. My name is Alice Hogue and I'll be your instructor. I'd like to start off on the right foot with a little Cajun joke, and I'm going to do it with the accent. Boudreaux's wife Maurice passed away, and Boudreaux called the 911 operator. The 911 operator told Boudreaux that she would send somebody right away. But she said, "Where do you live at? Where are you at?" asked the operator. And Boudreaux says, "I live at the end of South Eucalyptus Drive." And she said, "Well, can you spell that for me?" And Boudreaux says, well, there was a long pause, and finally Boudreaux says, "How about if I drag her over to Oak Street and you can pick her up there?" All right. So for those of you that don't know, eucalyptus is really hard to spell. It's E-U-C-A-L-Y-P-T-U-S. Okay. So let's then talk about the rights of the surface owner. Let's look at our agenda for today. And what I want to do is I want to talk about the overview of the impact to the surface. What exactly happens to the surface? And then I want to give some tips for surface owners. And then finally, how recovery costs are determined, and then the different state laws that impact those rights. Now, you'll remember that the mineral owner has the right to use as much of the surface as is reasonably necessary. So, under what we call the bundle of sticks, the mineral owner has the right to execute the lease, called the executory right. They have the right to receive the bonus. They have the right to receive delay rental payments. They have the right to receive the royalty, and they have the right to use as much of the surface as is reasonably necessary. So how do you protect those surface interests? Well, it depends on what your ownership interest is. For example, if you own in fee simple absolute, which means sometimes they just say fee simple, sometimes they say fee simple absolute. It means exactly the same thing. But that means you own both the surface and the minerals. In other words, somewhere in the chain of title, there was no predecessor in interest that granted the survey and reserved the minerals. So the surface and the minerals remained intact. In that case, those provisions in the oil and gas lease are going to control how you protect the surface. Now, usually they'll say, it'll say we'll pay damages for timber or growing crops. That's pretty typical. But if the mineral owner wants protection beyond that, and we'll go over what some of those are, I'll give you some information or tips that they're giving mineral owners to protect the surface. In that case, they're going to have to add amendments to the typical oil and gas lease. In the printed form, usually it's not going to cover a lot of surface issues. It'll cover growing crops or timber, but not to the depth that I'm going to show you the amendments that you can put in there. Now, of course, if you own the surface, okay, and I know that this is called the rights of the surface owner, but the thing to keep in mind is the surface owner really doesn't have any rights. The surface owner really doesn't have any rights unless he can get with the mineral owner and ask the mineral owner to protect him by putting provisions in the oil and gas lease itself. So if you have a good rapport with your surface owner, or the surface owner, finds out or knows who the mineral owner is, that is the best way to protect your interests, is to have those provisions in the oil and gas lease. So it really is kind of a misnomer to say surface rights, because we know that the mineral estate is dominant to the surface estate. So if you only own the surface, your only means of protection is to get with that mineral owner and get them to put those provisions in the lease. Or maybe you have a kind-hearted mineral owner, or the mineral owner is related to the surface owner, and in that case they may just go ahead and include some of these clauses in there. But if you own the mineral interest, these are the clauses that you would want to put in the oil and gas lease to protect the surface. So let's look at what some of those different types of advice are, different types of amendment. So these are tips that are given to landowners as they negotiate the surface use. So these are, research that I've done online that talks about these are the issues to include in your lease if you own the surface. And so it's useful for us then to get a better perspective, to understand the perspective of the surface owner or the user and the oil and gas company, to learn what that advice is that's being given to surface owners. So let's take a look at that advice. But before we do that, I want you to recognize what happens to the surface. Why do we need to put these protections in place? I know some of the videos that I've given you in this module will show you what happens to the surface, but it really is a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Commotion. I mean, there's a lot going on with the surface. So let me just remind you of what goes on and recalling this from our industry overview. So the first thing that happens when we drill for an oil and gas well, you've got to shoot seismic. And that is where they put these little football, they look like the little things that you put a football on before you kick it, before your field goal. That's what they look like. And you put these in the ground, and they actually take their shoe and press it into the ground. And those are all connected by this wire. And so they have a thumper truck, and the thumper truck will come along, and it has this huge piece of equipment on the end of it, and it will actually hit the surface of the earth. And then those little sound waves will be picked up through those little football cleat things are called geophones. And then those will be taken to the truck where there's a geophysicist who's interpreting that data. So that's the first thing that happens on the property is seismic is shot. Now this doesn't really cause any damage to the surface other than the little, place where the little cleats are. So there's really not a lot of damage that goes on there. But what I want to remember is when we're talking about shooting seismic, you have to get permission from the mineral owner because it's the mineral owner's interest that you are getting information about. A lot of people think it is the surface owner, and I know a lot of right-of-way people that will just go to whoever's living on the land, knock on the door, and say, hey, do we have permission to shoot seismic? And, technically they don't really have the authority, but, a lot of times the mineral owner doesn't find out. And so since there's really no damage to the land or to the surface, it's not really a big deal. All right, then once we shoot seismic and we decide that we do want to drill for oil and gas, the first thing we have to do is we have to get a well permit from the state. The well permit is, we're going to say where that well is to be located, and the state will say whether or not they approve of that well permit. If they approve the well permit, then we start doing the leasing of the land. Actually, we do the leasing of the land right after shooting seismic. Then we get the well permit if we decide we're going to produce. You can actually have that well permit in either place. But once you have the well permit, that gives you the right then to start clearing the timber. Once you have the well permit and the lease, right? I mean, you remember you can't go onto the property without permission, and it's that oil and gas lease that gives you permission to be on it. So once you have the well permit and you have the oil and gas leases signed, permission granted from the mineral owners, then you start clearing the timber. Remember we said, why do we clear the timber? And I always make a joke about because oil and gas companies don't like trees. No, that's not it at all. What it is there's going to be a lot of equipment coming in. So we have to build access roads for that equipment. If we have to meander around the many different trees that are there, that's going to slow us up. And so the timber will be cleared so you have room for this huge expansive pad or platform. So the trees are cleared, then we can build those access roads. And there's usually roads coming in and roads coming out. One coming in is called an ingress road, and the one going out is called an egress road. So they'll talk about ingress and egress. Then they're going to build that pad. Now, this is either a concrete pad or it's like caliche. And I wish I could give you dimensions for it, but I don't really have it other than what you'll see in those videos. But, it takes a substantial portion of the land because it's not only that the well has to go there, but all of the equipment has to go there. All the different pits, the mud pit, the shale pit, the rig pit, all that needs to go on there. The actual derrick needs to go on there. So, and usually there's parking for all the trucks that are loading and unloading the equipment. There's a place called a dog house where the operator can view what's going on underground. They've got computer systems and all that. So all of that is going to take up room on the surface. The other thing that happens is they'll build pipelines. That is, once we have production, we need to have a way to get the gas to the power plants or the oil to the refineries. And a lot of times they will drill, they will have tanks on the property that will hold that. And they will have pipes leading from those tanks to wherever it's being connected. So there's a lot going on the surface. And that's why these protections for surface use are so important. So, as I said, the one way, if you do not own the minerals, what you can do is, or if you do own the minerals, you can add clauses in your oil and gas lease that require them to restore the land to its condition prior to any operations. So that is one lease provision, and this is called reclamation. And to give you an idea about this, I have a little 12-year-old daughter, and she had a project in her school in her science that was talking about reclamation and reclaiming the land and how to get the land back to the way it was. And so they had them each take a chocolate chip cookie, if you can picture this, and they bent unbent a paper clip, and they would have the students dig out those chocolate chip cookies and then put the dirt, if you will, the dirt from the chocolate chip cookie in the hole to fill up where that chip was. That's what reclamation is. They are required to get the surface back to its original position as possible. Now, obviously, they can't put the trees back, but they could plant new trees. So those are all the things that you want to think about if you are the surface owner or the mineral owner. Hopefully you can get that mineral owner to include this. So if you have a lease clause that will require compensation for all surface damages, then the lessee will be liable even though the injuries were incurred during the reasonable development. So we're going to put damages in there beyond just for growing crops. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, these are the specific items of liability. Even though you have the right to use the surface and the lease gives us the right to use the surface, the mineral owner can impose additional duties to the oil and gas company by including these in the oil and gas lease. And so some of them will specifically state what the damages are if there is, for example, injuries to crops or pastures. You're going to pay this amount. Or if there's growing timber, or there's erosion or stagnation of the soil as a result of you removing the trees, removing the growing timber. If this happens, you're going to pay us X amount of money. Livestock, any damages to livestock, so much money for every cow that dies, so much money for, whatever injury occurs to livestock. And then fences, ditches, and canals. They'll say what you have to pay to the mineral owner for every feet of fence that you build, or ditches that you dig, or canals that you dig. And then there is a cost for buildings and structures. So if they want to add specific structures on the land, then there's going to be a payment for that as well, compensation. And then they talk about how the oil and gas company is going to compensate if there is water pollution. Now, this is a big issue right now with fracking because, as you'll see in this, the two documentaries that you'll see on Gasland and Frack Nation, the accusation against the oil and gas company is that fracking causes water pollution. There have not been any lawsuits that have held up that said that. There's not been anyone that could prove to us that water pollution occurred as a result of fracking. Now, water pollution can occur as a result of there's some leakage in the well. A lot of those, especially the one that you saw in Dimick, Pennsylvania, that they talk about in Gasland. I had a student one time who was from Pennsylvania, and he said that he actually lived in Dimick. And so I asked him, what was the cause of that? What really happened? And of course, no one really knew what the cause was because I forget who the oil and gas company was there. I want to say Chesapeake, but I'm not positive. It was Cabot. So Cabot, settled out of court with the people who were suing them. And they said one of the elements of the lawsuit was that there would be confidentiality. So the people who were affected couldn't really talk about, what Cabot did to help them or what the actual cause was according to Cabot. But this student of mine said that they believe what happened was that it was from a leaky oil tank or a tank on the land that was leaking and leached down below the water table. Because remember, the water table is only 400 feet below the surface. So when we're doing fracking, we're drilling miles and miles beneath the surface. So 400 feet, we've well passed the water table, and we've provided for protection. We have not only steel pipe in the ground, but around that steel pipe we have concrete, and around that concrete we have another steel pipe, and around that steel pipe we have another concrete. So that case that you will see in Gasland is not as a result of fracking. It is a result of something being on the land, a leaky tank being on the land. Haynesville is another DVD that's out there, and I'm trying to get permission from the owners to let me show it in my class, but I haven't gotten that yet. But that is the concern that those mineral owners have, is they're talking about this place in, it was in Texas. What was the name of that place? I can't remember the name of it. But that's what happened to that town. There was some leakage from some oil production, and as a result, their water was contaminated. So a lot of times in the Haynesville video, this is what their main concern is. Their main concern is water pollution. What are you going to give us, oil and gas company, if there is some kind of water pollution? We're not talking about just fracking. We're talking about any kind of water pollution, including leakage from tanks. So you want to get that all resolved beforehand. And so the other issues that you want to get nailed down, in addition to identifying what the specific liability is for each of these items, is to establish how this is going to be paid. Are you going to require a bond? That is, the oil and gas company is going to pay you a sum of money, and whatever they don't use, you're going to give it back to them at the end. That's a bond. Or are you going to require advance payment as security? Then you want to determine and negotiate how those claims are going to be distributed. Do you want them paid annually? This is all the damage you did to our property this year, therefore these are all the damages that we will seek. Or a lump sum. Do you want to wait till the end of there's production and then say to the oil and gas company, okay, let's calculate up all the damages and this is what you owe us in a lump sum. And then you want to designate the time period. You want to say to them, all these claims must be paid within blank period of time, either from the incident or from the time the well is drilled. Now, if there's no agreement, you want to provide for some kind of arbitration. How is this going to get settled if we disagree on what the prices are or disagree on our interpretation of these surface damages. You can provide that there would be arbitration, that is, that the mineral owner would not have to sue the oil and gas company, but the oil and gas company could be brought before some kind of arbitration panel or mediation that would occur, so that there was mutual agreement as to how this was going to occur. And if there wasn't mutual agreement, then the arbitrator would decide what the actual damages would be. Okay, so now let's look at those. Now that we've got the financial side of it down, let's look at what those specific provisions are that you can add. So I'm going tip by tip here. Forgot to designate this, but the first tip is that you require restoration. You insert that in the lease clause that you're going to have to restore the land. A lot of times it's implied, but it's not going to hurt anything to put it in the lease agreement. Then step 2 is you're not only going to require them to restore the surface, but you're going to require them to pay for all surface damages. And here we said these were the typical surface damages that most people would include in their lease, and then this is what the compensation would be. It would be agreed to, and then we would agree when to pay it, how to pay it, the time period to pay it, and if there was an agreement. So then for tip number 3, designate the location of the structures. You can provide in your oil and gas lease that there must be prior written consent before anything is drilled. So before a road is built, before there's telephone lines, before there's saltwater disposal sites or wells. Or you can agree that they have to get your prior written consent by attaching a map of the proposed lease areas, and then you would have the right to agree or disagree. And this is something really that, they don't really have a lot of trouble doing, unless, you're trying to weave around trees. But, the wells you might have a harder time negotiating because that's kind of mandated by the Texas Railroad Commission. But these other things, the roads, the telephone lines, the saltwater disposal sites, if they want your lease badly enough, they will be willing to, allow you to give written consent. Now, one of the more common things that you can be designated is the location of the flow lines, the gathering lines, and the pipelines. And again, this really is not that difficult for the oil and gas company to do, because they just allow the owner to say, look, I'd rather the pipeline be here other than here, because this way it would go under where the cows are, and I don't want to disturb the cows, so could you put it kind of on the edge of the property so it doesn't run right through the property? And so you give the owner the right to specify the location of those wells, where the gathering lines are going to be, and where the underground pipelines are going to be. So they can specify the location, the depth, the width, and what we call the setbacks. And they can request something called double trenching when possible. And that is just a method of backfilling. So, when you're when you're digging in your garden, for example, the first layer that you take off is the layer of earth, like where the grass is, okay? If you're requiring double trenching, they're going to have to put that dirt in a separate place than the dirt that's underneath that dirt. And then that way, when they go back to put the surface back, you have the grass that was there go back neatly on the surface instead of just this messed up plowed mess of just dirt going back into it. So you can actually request this double trenching method, and it is less, it looks better on the land is the only advantage, than just, digging a hole and covering back up with the same dirt. So that's another thing that you can do, is you can designate the location of the structures, and you can designate how they could restore that land using double trenching. Other structures, you want to avoid putting where it's just convenient to the producer. If there are production facilities on site and they look kind of like this, you kind of want to keep them tucked away and out of sight. And you want to locate it, so that it minimizes the silhouette against the horizon. So, a lot of times if the sun sets on a certain area, that's not going to be where they're going to want to put the production facilities because they can't see the sunrise. They're going to want to put it along the side of their property so it doesn't interfere with, it doesn't look like as soon as you see the land, that's all you see is these production tanks. So they're going to try to figure out a way to put it where it's not just convenient to the producer, but that it looks aesthetically pleasing to the eye of where the land is located. Okay, so again, designating the location of the structures, they're going to want to put those production facilities as much as they can out of sight. Another tip for designating location of the structures. You want to put clauses in there that says your land will not be used to service the leases of other people's property. So the facilities on your surface which service production off lease, like these kind of gathering lines, and all of these things may not be for your well, then you want to put a clause in there that says it's only for the benefit of our land. You don't want everyone else's land to be pristine and everything on your land because you didn't have one of these clauses in here. So you put a clause in there that says no facilities will be allowed on your surface that service production off lease. You also do not want to grant them the unrestricted right to construct permanent facilities such as power stations, storage tanks, or employees' quarters. Those you do not want them to have on your property, and therefore you can put it in the oil and gas lease saying that you may not put these permanent facilities on there like power stations or storage tanks or employees' quarters. You don't want a bunch of people living on your land. So that is designate the location of structures. And then the next one is to require environmental protections, tip number 4. So what that means is that they want you to line all pits. Remember we said we have the shale pit and the reserve pit and the mud pit. Well, let's take the mud pit, for example. The mud pit is not just water and dirt to make mud. It is a chemical composition that they're using to, remember, make it heavy enough so that it prevents a blowout, but light enough so that it'll allow the rocks to flow through, allow the mud to flow through. So since some of the stuff used is, you don't want leaching into the earth, you would require that they line all pits. And then you say how and where they would discharge the produced water. You would require that reclamation plan, get those chocolate chip cookies out. And then you also may want to require a dust control plan. This is a very dusty, dirty job, all this drilling. So you may want to have something in place that says how they're going to control the dust. Another consideration is tip number 5. Consider aesthetic requirements. You don't want to have this on your land, right? This old rusty tanks. This is where a lot of the leaching takes place because they're old and they start rusting. So you can require that they have low profile tanks and pumping units and that they paint those tanks. Something like this where it's a nice neutral color and it sort of blends into the landscape. Now, you do not have to be as patriotic as these people, right? Although there's no harm in that. But usually they'll require that you at least paint those tanks and keep them painted. Another aesthetic requirement is to landscape around the sites. Like if you look at this one, you see it's got all these weeds around it. It's just unsightly. And so if that's your land, you don't want to see that on your land. So you may require that there be landscaping around these tanks. And then also you can include provisions that require weed control plan on roads around equipment and gates. That means the weeds will be kept to a minimum or, kept neatly so there's not a bunch of weeds growing along the roads that they've built on your land. And then you may also ask them to bury pipelines if it's a scenic area. You want to require them to remove their trash, and you want to have a strict trash containment policy to avoid what we call lunch bag effect. So you have a bunch of workers and they come to work and they all have their lunches in these Walmart bags, these little plastic bags, And what happens when they're done with their lunch? They just leave it on the ground. So you have these blowing lunch bags that are blowing across the field. So you want to have, you could put a provision in there that covers that specific issue. Okay, so that's aesthetic. The next thing that they may ask for is to consider noise reduction provisions. This is a very, very noisy construction that goes on with the well. I remember when I was in law school, I was in an apartment, and they started drilling a well. It was, probably a half a mile from the apartment. There was so much clanging, and, the lights were on at nighttime, and it was just a very noisy operations. So if you live on the land or you live near the land, you could put a rule in there that says we don't want any nighttime operations we don't want any operations at nighttime, especially near the house. Compressors. They're kind of like engines that you use in when we're drilling for gas. If you have a pipeline and you have gas in that pipeline, that gas is just going to sit in the pipeline. It doesn't flow like oil. It just kind of sits there. So you have a piece of equipment called a compressor that pushes the gas through that pipeline. And those compressors are also very loud. I think I have in one of the videos that I showed you in this module these noise reduction devices that they had, including putting like what's it called, like a little shed around it that has soundproofing inside of it. So I had some people in my class that didn't know that those kinds of things were available, and they had some lessees trying to lease their land, and so they were able to put that in there because of this class, because there was these noise reduction like little sheds that you could put around the compressor that would make it quieter. This is especially common when we're talking about coal bed methane, because coal bed methane, if you have a compressor for coal bed methane, it is like a sounding, what's the word? It's almost like a clap of thunder. It's so loud. And it scares the horses, it scares the livestock. So to the extent that you can, you want to require some type of noise reduction provision in that lease. Other noise reduction provisions that you would consider is a traffic plan. So, you might want to say, hey, trucks can't go any faster than 5 miles per hour. Because if they're going 35 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour down this little, road, what's it going to do? It's going to kick up a whole bunch of dust. You could also establish the hours of operation. No nighttime activities and no nighttime drilling, and no drilling after until after 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning. You could also designate when the trucks can come in and leave. So by 5 o'clock, and then they can start again at 8 o'clock the next morning. Trucks make a lot of noise going in and out. Remember, they're trucking equipment. Those big long pipeline, they're trucking in the derrick, they're trucking in the mud components that they need. And then you could establish the points of ingress and egress. And you can also limit the number of trucks that they have going to the property per day. No more than 50 trucks a day, for example. So those are just some other ideas, some noise reduction provisions. Now, I will tell you that, it depends whether or not they're going to grant you all of these different surface use accommodations. Depends on how big of a landowner you are. If you own 5 acres, you may not have the negotiating capability that someone that owns on the lease tract or someone that owns a significant amount of acreage would. So a lot of the negotiation, because these are imposing burdens on the oil and gas company, and they're willing to work with you, if they know that you're a major landowner and they want to keep you happy, otherwise they won't be able to drill. But if you're a small landowner, you may not get all of these accommodations made. So again, we're trying to put this into the mineral lease itself so that we can protect the surface. All right, tip number 7, limit the surface use. Remember, under the dominant mineral estate, it says that the mineral estate is dominant over the surface estate. Another way to say that is the surface estate is servient to the dominant estate. The surface estate serves the dominant estate. So that means that you have the right to use as much of the surface as is reasonably necessary. But that doesn't mean that you have the right to come onto their land, hunt on their land, fish in their lakes, let them have a gun range on your property. So you may put in there that they need to post signs that there's no trespassing, so that you keep everyone else out other than the workers that need to be there. You post signs that say no hunting, no fishing, no firearms, or no alcohol consumption. I got alcohol misspelled. And then insist on a fire plan. What's going to happen if there is a blowout? What are you going to do? What's the plan? So those are all things that you can do to limit the surface use. Yes, it's as much of the surface as is reasonably necessary, but, firearms with a gun range, that's not reasonably necessary to develop oil and gas on the land. The next big issue that we see is the protection of livestock. So tip number 8 is protect the livestock. I've seen this in many, many leases that you build cattle guards. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with cattle guards, these are bars that are put over the threshold where the fence gate opens. And they're actually bars like this, but they're kind of put close together. And for whatever reason, cows are afraid of them, and cows will not walk on them to get across. So it's a way of keeping the livestock in. So you can require that they build these cattle guards. That is, everywhere where a cow could get out, where it's not fenced, you would put these bars in the earth between the gate, if you will, or between the opening, and that way it would keep the cows in. You could also require them to fence off certain areas. You don't want the cows coming and drinking from the mud pit, so you may require them to fence off certain areas to make sure that the cows cannot get to it. You may also consider requiring that the oil and gas company wash each of the trucks that come in and out, because there's something called hoof and mouth disease that's carried from outside to inside. From I think it's airborne. So you want to make sure that the trucks coming in and out don't carry any disease on it that could harm your cow, your livestock. So you could put this truck washing provision. Every time they come into the land, they have to have that truck washed down so they're not bringing in all the germs and dirt from wherever they've been. So that is another provision that they could use. All right, so now let's look at recovery costs. This is basically how courts are going to determine what the damages are for injury to the surface. If you specifically spell it out, that's great. But if you don't, this is how the court is going to interpret it. Now, the first one is called temporary injuries. And temporary injuries are those that are sporadic and contingent on irregular force. So it's, do you have the ability to terminate this injury, which can be corrected, and that injury is temporary? For example, the diversion of the natural flow of water to cause flooding. That is temporary because, yes, it's flooded out, but it's not a permanent damage. Ultimately, the flooding is going to subside, and therefore that's considered a temporary injury. Yes, you still caused damage, but it was only temporary. So in that case, the damages are going to be less. But if it's permanent, that is, something that happened. Permanent is defined as when the cost of restoration exceeds the market value before the injury. So this would be something like an escape or discharge of oil, of salt water, or mud on the land, or rocks from other lands. If there's some kind of a landslide. The usual damage would be depreciation in value. But if we're measuring damages in a permanent situation, it's going to be the difference in market value before and after the injury or restoration cost, whichever is lesser. So those are to give you some ideas of how a court would interpret what the injury is. If it's a temporary injury, you're not going to get a lot of recovery from that. But if it's a permanent injury, then the courts are going to say they're going to use the market value rule to determine what the damage caused is. Okay, now I want you to be aware of certain state laws. So in Texas, it's the Texas Railroad Commission who has the authority to prevent surface water from being polluted. I think they interview in Frac Nation one of the Texas Railroad Commissioners, and they talk about how they've received all these complaints and they've gone and independently investigated those complaints, and that really the state of Texas has the largest environmental protection agency, if you will, which being the Texas Railroad Commission, in the country. So, they are going to be very thorough in their investigations, and in Frac Nation they were saying that they have never seen an indication of surface water as a result of fracking. Now, there can be this surface water or pollution, for a leaky tank on the land. But it's the Texas Railroad Commission that regulates all these activities associated with exploration. They are who you go to when you want to get a well permit. They are who you go to when you want to unitize the land. That's the Texas Railroad Commission. Now, one interesting thing about the Texas Railroad Commission is that they are charged to issue and enforce cleanup orders, or if there's no one to clean it up, then they have to undertake the cleanup operations and recover the costs from whoever caused the damage to the land. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is that the Texas Railroad Commission only has authority over operators. So if, for example, if your company is not the operator, they do not have any authority over you, only the operator. So they would only hold the operator liable if any of these damages occurs. They cannot hold a non-operator liable. They just don't have that type of authority. But they're the ones that set the cleanup standards, and then they also monitor groundwater investigations, like you saw in Frac Nation, and remediation activities to make sure the land is restored. So that's important to know. Now, Oklahoma has what's called an Oklahoma Surface Damages Act. This is because the population of Oklahoma decided that, or the representatives in their legislature decided that it's not fair that the surface owner doesn't get compensated at all. And so they have now put in by statute that the surface owner has to be compensated for any damages to the property as a result of oil and gas operations, including treble damages. That means tripling the damages for certain kinds of things. And if there's a diminution of fair market value to the surface, then the estate's value is going to be the fair market value. Now, this is important to know because in Oklahoma, even though the mineral estate is dominant, you still have to negotiate with the surface owners, specifically regarding their surface damages. Now, there was a recent case. I don't think I have it. No, I don't have it on me. But there was a case where it was an oil and gas company, or these surface owners, and the oil and gas company under this law is required to attempt to reach a negotiated settlement. So they have an attempt, they have to reach out, they have to try to negotiate with the surface owner and try to come to a reasonable agreement. But there was a case where the surface owner said, we are not going to agree unless you pay us $1 million in damages. Well, that's probably more than what, the oil was going to produce, at least initially. And the court said you can't hold the oil and gas company hostage by requesting something that's unreasonable. And so all the oil and gas company is required to do is make a reasonable effort to negotiate with you. Now, if the surface owners won't agree to anything, then fine. All we have to do is prove to the court that these are the, we've reached out to these people, these are the communications we've had with them, these are the offers that we've made with them, and they have refused. But we still have to attempt to negotiate it in order to be protected under this statute. So they can't hold the oil and gas company hostage. They have to agree that to something reasonable. Okay, and so that brings us to our conclusion. So we started with an overview, sort of the impact to the surface. I said it starts with surface, that seismic, shooting seismic, and then it goes to clearing the timber, to drilling the different mud pits, the shale pit, and where the derrick goes. And then we talked about the huge concrete pad that needed to be drilled. And then we talked about the roads going in and out. And then we talked about specific tips for surface owners. And we said that the major way a surface owner could protect their interests is to get with the mineral owner and get those clauses put into the mineral lease. Otherwise, the only rights the surface owners have, and I don't think I made this clear, but there was a Texas case where they said, what does the surface owner own versus what does the mineral owner own? And they said that things that were, the mineral owner owns the minerals. So things like caliche, which is something that we use to build roads, and we'll talk about that in Stake Your Claim. Caliche, anything that wasn't a mineral belonged to the surface owner, and that includes water. Water is not a mineral, so water belongs to the surface owner. That is the one leverage that they do have, is if you want to use their water, then they can negotiate a stricter surface agreement between you and them. I forgot to make that point. I'm glad I remembered that. And then we talked about how courts determine recovery costs for these. And then we talked about the different state laws, specifically the Texas Railroad Commission and how it only has authority over the operators, and the Oklahoma state law, the Oklahoma Surface Damages Act. And that concludes our presentation on on the rights of the surface owner. Are there any questions about what we've covered today? You can either raise your hand or you can put a question in the question box. Oh, Liz knew it was Cabot. Good. Okay, I was right about that. Okay, a couple of things about the falling oil and gas prices. I just want to give you my insights into that. The people that attended the live webinar last week, I shared my thoughts with them, but I decided I was going to go ahead and put it in this one so that you could have the recorded version as well. And here is what I'm thinking. Oil prices are taking a huge hit. That is true. But keep in mind that this is a cyclical industry. You knew this going in. It is a boom and bust industry. So we were in a boom, and now that oil prices are falling, we are in a bust. Now, don't panic, because what oil and gas companies do is they do what they call hedge their oil prices. So they will enter into a contract with oil purchasers that says no matter what the cost of oil per barrel is, according to Bloomberg or West Texas Intermediate, we are still going to get paid $90 a barrel. So, for example, a company like Newfield has in place a purchase contract that says we're going to continue to get $90 a barrel for oil, no matter what the actual cost is. So, if oil continues to fall, then we may see some fallout as far as people losing their jobs. But, there's someone from ExxonMobil was talking. His name was Rex Tillerson. And he says, at Exxon, we don't worry about this, gas prices going up. We're hedged out to 2030. So that's why a lot of times you won't see, even though the oil price is falling, you won't see a huge reaction by the oil and gas companies because of this hedging. Now, if it goes beyond, 2015, you know, you may see the oil and gas companies having to let people go. But don't worry about that right now. The other thing to keep in mind is that the experts are saying this will probably last 2015 and 2016. So that gives us plenty of time to, you know, to take advantage of that hedged oil before we go into panic mode. So just want, you know, all of you to be watching this. This is the big issue. It used to be fracking. Now it's the cost of oil. And so what's happening is that there's been an overproduction, because of our fracking, because of our shale plays. And so Saudi Arabia, usually when this happens, is they'll stop production, and then this, under the law of supply and demand, supply will go down and demand will increase, and then the oil price will get back to where we want it to be. But what's happening is the Saudi Arabians are trying to now compete with the shale production here. And so they're saying at this point that they're not going to turn off their nozzles to help us out. I don't want any of you to lose heart. This has happened before. It'll happen again. And, you know, if you just hang in there, you'll be fine. Okay, I see that I do have some questions. Let's see. Is there such a thing as a standard cost list for reclamation, like trees, dirt, or crops? There is, and I don't know what they are off the bat, but that is a great question. But I know it's so much money per tree, and so much money for damaged crops, and it's a pretty standard number, but I cannot remember what it is. But let me look that up for you, Kanda, and I'll let you know. Standard costs. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay, well, if there's no more questions, you've been a great audience, and I look forward to seeing you in the next webinar.